Dear people, welcome. Jared, do you want to sit here? Or? No, okay. Welcome, everybody, to the Global Routing Operations Working Group session at IETF 119 in the illustrious city of Brisbane in Australia. If you did not intend to be in Australia, talk to me after the session. We have a fun agenda today, but before we dive into the agenda, let me introduce my co-chair, Chris Morrow, who is attending remotely. Say hi, Chris.
Hello.
Great. It is, what, midnight for you?
1 a.m. Yes.
Thank you for your sacrifice. First of all, the note well. In any interactions with each other at this IETF meeting, please be respectful to each other. Be mindful of the fact that there can be difference in perspective, difference in experience, and that we're here together to jointly learn. IETF contributions are considered anything you say at the microphone, anything you say to each other, anything you send to the mailing list. Strive to be excellent towards each other. Now, for this specific working group and this session, we have a few online resources. You can find the agenda, the accompanying draft documents, our Zulip chat room, which me and Chris are monitoring, and there's a collaborative notes webpage that can be used to take minutes. M&S Trivia. Please scan the QR code where at the back of the room, I guess, is the QR code. Yeah. Scanning the QR code helps us do capacity planning for the next session. So make sure to use your data tracker login to signal that you're here. Before we continue, we're going to need a note taker. Do I hear a remote volunteer, Chris?
Yeah, I can take notes. I just pulled up the notes doc.
All right, thank you. Jabberscribe is now, I guess, Zulipscribe. I will do that. Let's take a look at the agenda. We have a session of 90 minutes with about 85 minutes of content. So that means there's some time for questions and discussion. That's good news. The agenda is as following. We'll start with a new independent submission called the Peering API. Then our referent of BMP will give us the latest and greatest on a wide variety of BMP drafts. Tobias will give us an update on the BGP operations best current practices document. We'll have a little bit more BMP in the realm of stats and reports and TCP AO. And if we plow through this entire agenda, we will be at the end. So let me pull up the slides for our first presenter, the Peering API. Jenny? Oh, it's going to be two people. I should. Oh, there's one microphone, so you got to take turns.
Okay, we'll split.
This is Jenny and Tom. I think for both of you, it's your first IETF, so I'm super excited you made it all the way down under and are gracing us with your presence. And take it away. The floor is yours. Yes, I don't know if it works, but good luck. Oh, my OpenBSD laptop, that's going to be good. My apologies. Please tell me if you would like the next slide to appear, and I will make sure that happens.
Thank you very much. All right, I'm Jenny. I'm from Meta, and I'm here today with Tom from Cloudflare. We're going to talk to you today about the peering API, or our proposal for the programmatic handling of peering requests. And I note it's the two of us, but this is joint work also with Carlos from Amazon, Matt from 20C, and Arturo from Google. Next slide, please. maybe. Good. All right, just to reiterate again, this is joint work from the 5 of us, but we're actively looking for more collaborators. So please let us know if this is of interest. Next slide. Cool. All right, so what will we talk about today? First off, I will give the previous work that's been done sort of for the uh, interconnection of peering requests, the present state of affairs, and then our proposed solution along with a demo and the future work we'd like to do. Next slide, please. So before, as some of you may know, right, BGP peering was managed largely over email. You know, people would write to each other to say, I'm at this location, can we establish an interconnection? It takes multiple emails for each request. It's a lot of manual time that it doesn't necessarily need to be manual, and you might like to free up for more impactful, interesting work. Next slide, please. So what is it today? Today, many companies, myself, Cloudflare, 20C included, have set up these self-service web portals for requesting your interdomain interconnections. You'll see on the left, there's Meta's, Cloudflare's, and 20C's, right? You go, you select, I'm at these locations, I'd like these BGP sessions, you click an easy button, it's done. Most of these are backed behind PeeringDB OAuth or other forms of authentication, but it still requires a human to actually go to a page, type in a bunch of stuff, and click some buttons. What if you removed that sort of manual human effort? Next slide, please. So we'd like to propose this API. There are several goals of this API. First off, we want to enable machine-to-machine interconnection between autonomous systems or BGP peers. We want to reduce the human time spent actually configuring this, and then also improve the network latency, hopefully by encouraging more BGP peering or other connections where we can. Again, I know a question we get a lot is, what about the security requirements for this, right? You can't just let anybody request these connections, right? So, you know, there's PeeringDB OAuth today. Perhaps in future, we'll also have other options like RPKI. But as to our actual, next slide, please. Our actual proposal, we have a demo for you today, along with our future work. In this demo, it is just the V0. We only support public peering, and we have 2 endpoints, the locations endpoint and the sessions endpoint, where you can request or query or delete your sessions. So over to Tom for the actual demo.
Next slide, please. So this is the first aspect of the API. Do note that this already has established the OAuth authorization aspect of this. So you already have the JWT token that actually identifies you and authorizes you for establishing these peering sessions. Not entirely relevant to this API, which is why it's left out of demo. So what you see here is, you know, a peer, specifically Meta. I think that's 32934. Yep. Yeah. So that's Meta is requesting peering, or is requesting, it's like, hey, we want to peer with Cloudflare. So they hit our endpoint, and they're specifically just asking, it's like, hey, we want to get all of the public sessions that we could set up with Cloudflare in all of the mutual locations. So that's the request that you see here, right? Like the ASN is provided and the location type being public. The return that you get is the identifier of the internet exchange, the PeeringDB identifier specifically, and the type as well, given that, again, the goal of the API here is to not just do public sessions, but also PNIs. So then the available, the type you'd get is private, right? So that kind of all makes sense. Next slide, please. You can see the request ID here at the bottom as well. This is to do deduplication and to make sure that you can do proper tracking of requests if you have that in a database and things like that, so that, you know, if you're setting up a session, you can start doing pruning and things like that. That's what the request ID is for. So we've now, you know, Meta has done the GET request. They received the PeeringDB identifier. They know exactly where they want to go. So they've now made a POST request to our endpoint with the information provided: local ASN, local IP, peer ASN, peer IP. I apologize for not using documentation prefixes, but at least this time around, we own the IP address. So it's better than most.
Nice try.
You know, doesn't hurt. So push request is made, and at that point, they'll get a reply back, usually mostly mirroring back the information provided with a HTTP 200 reply with, we received the request, we'll process it. Next slide, please. So at that point, the request has kind of been handled, gets ingested into a database on the Cloudflare side, At that point, we can set up a 6-hour, 3-hour, whatever kind of cron job that goes through all of these requests and automatically then configures the routers to set up the BGP sessions, and Meta can do the same on their side, at which point the sessions are established and everything's okay. A good example of like an implementation for this is when Meta or Cloudflare add a new POP, we can then add that into the automated systems so that at that point we automatically just kind of send these requests across. Peerings come up automatically and we don't have to deal with any of this, because normally, if you join a new internet exchange, one of the things you do is you send an email to the tech list going, it's like, hey, we're new here. And then you get, 1,500 emails that you need to set up peering sessions. With the peering API, that kind of goes away. So future work that we really want to work on and that we're really kind of eager to get some feedback on is PNI connections, right? So as we've mentioned, public exchange peering first, but PNI connections, as the vast majority of traffic on the internet actually goes through PNIs, not internet exchanges. That needs to be automated as well. There's some additional caveats that we need to kind of account for in PNIs, where it's like the LOA generation. It's like who's going to send the LOA, MMR locations, like everything else that kind of comes with that. There's a lot of kind of difficulty and complexity there. Also, the reason why it's not implemented in V0, let's be honest, right? Is there. So that's for add PNI. It's the same thing for augmenting PNI. Network keeps growing, so we need to kind of keep augmenting the PNI. So we want to add that as a feature to the API as well. So that can also be entirely automated. If you have an automated system that monitors your traffic levels, if that breaches a specific threshold, you can again make that GET request, that POST request, and everything else, so that the entire system kind of is automated. I know a lot of data center providers provide APIs these days to kind of basically set up the mostly automate the setup of cross connects. So that would be nice to kind of tie into that. Configurable PNI options, right, is like, do you want to do MD5? Do you want to do TCP/AO? Kind of everything else that kind of comes with PNIs. We also want to add maintenance as a feature request, especially for public peering, but also for PNIs. Sometimes networks take their peering offline because they're doing a router maintenance, or there's an internet exchange maintenance, or whatever else. That sometimes fires off a pager on the other side of the peering connection because, oh dear God, we lost the traffic with our biggest peer and everything's on fire. What's going on? With this, you could fire off a request to the API to notify the peering networks, like, hey, we're doing a maintenance. You can silence your alerts or whatever else, so that people actually know what's going on, and you don't have to send like emails to the mailing list. Next slide, please. There's obviously some security concerns, as Jenny mentioned earlier. Currently, we're relying on PeeringDB OAuth. PeeringDB is a third-party entity, right? It is neutral for now, but who knows? So that's something to consider. Maybe there's alternatives available that we could leverage that are built better into the existing internet routing ecosystem. We're thinking here, like RPKI checklists, things like that. I know the two co-authors of that draft are present, so that might be interesting. And some additional checks, right? Like, should this person be allowed to actually request peering, and then some additional kind of requirements there. Next slide, please. So what are we currently looking for? What's the next steps for us with this peering API? First of all, there's industry adoption. As we've shown, there's a V0 running. The auto peer endpoint for Cloudflare specifically is accessible by 20C as well as Meta. It's not a public endpoint yet, but we'll get there. So there's industry adoption. We'd be really interested to see further adoption by other parties and other implementations. So there's a Cloudflare implementation, there's a Meta implementation, and there's a 20C implementation of the software itself, or the API endpoint. We'd be more than eager or happy to see other implementations from the draft specifications that we've published. There's additional security requirements or considerations, maybe. Like I mentioned before, the PeeringDB side of things may or may not be a bit contentious. I'm not sure. RPKI checklists may or may not be interesting to kind of implement or to kind of add. And the biggest question, I guess, that we have is does this draft fit under the gross charter, or should we peddle this somewhere else? Is, I guess, the biggest question. Next slide, please. So We're inviting you all to have a discussion about this right now at the mic, but also tomorrow, March 21st, from 2 p.m. till 3 p.m. in M9. There's also WebEx available, which is available on the wiki. Please join us so we can have in-depth, at-length conversations about all of the things that we're doing wrong, which I'm sure is currently the case. And the draft is available here. The last version was pushed on Monday. And that's it from our side. Any questions?
Warren Kamari, Google. John says that it fits within section 2 of the charter. Document and suggest operational solutions to problematic aspects of blah, blah, blah. So.
Cool, thank you. So that's a yes.
Ben Madison from Work Online. I mean, this is probably more of a conversation for the side meeting tomorrow, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about how this actually practically changes workflows inside operators. Because I mean, speaking for myself, I mean, maybe you guys are a little bit more laissez-faire about this than I am, but I can't, like, if I was to run one of these endpoints, a call to that endpoint is never going to kick off a deployment of a new config. And so at best, I can kind of see a world in which everybody is only having to use one version of their own internal tools to do this stuff rather than using a half a dozen of other people's tools. And that, I suppose, is helpful. Maybe a bit of a work benefit balance conversation to be had if that's the case.
Yeah, there's a partial point. Fully agree that it doesn't always work for everyone that has an open peering policy. The goal here is that because it's programmatic, you can also then add programmatic constraints to what you can and do not want to accept.
Yep.
It's not because you're running the peering API that you have an open peering policy. You can still in the back end codify whatever kind of restrictions that you want. You can have a accept list, you can have a deny list, you can add whatever the hell you kind of want in that back end where you kind of go, it's like, well, yes.
So you teed up the second part of my question perfectly, which is, have you thought of a kind of sidecar work to this, which is a way of generically expressing which session requests you would automatically accept, what goes to review and what goes straight in the bin? I can imagine that being useful.
Yes, this is something that we have thought about and I think would be quite interesting. There's a section at the bottom of our draft where we touch on this, but we don't have a formal preferences or other way of expressing this. If that's something of interest, we'd love to chat. You could use it both for should we reject or accept these requests, but also a possible extension would be for PNI, let's set your policy for private peering. Who provides the LOA first? There are lots of extensions for this, and we'd be very interested to chat about this.
Thirdly, I'm more than happy to talk about the checklist thing. I think it's an obvious use case for it. It's the right way of doing it. And fourthly, really, if the only thing that comes out of this is not having a steaming pile of garbage for ordering cross connects on the side of the colo providers because of your collective clout, then I'm for it.
David Lamparter. Not being an operator myself, it is very unclear what pieces of software are actually implementing this API. I can guess at it because I do roughly understand how the entire peering world works, but I think this should be spelled out a little bit better because now I'm scared I have to implement this into actual routing protocol, which is definitely not what this is intending to do. So, yeah.
Yeah, briefly, the goal is this is a third endpoint that runs outside of your routers. This is not running on the routers itself. It might be in an ideal world actually run on the routers, but I think there's going to be some very severe apprehension about that. Exactly, because our routers are insecure by default. I don't want to run Nginx that's 10 years old at that point, so probably not great.
Rüdiger Volk. I'm pretty sure the peerings that I used to do before retirement would not have gone through this. But one thing I'm kind of curious is someone throws this in and it is seems to me completely unclear how to frame the expectations, one session, at which time to expect sessions to actually come up, and how to deal between the two knocks about, well, okay, it does not work, kind of, if there is no signaling when to expect the session, kind of, you also have a problem in figuring out when you have to debug.
Yes, that's a fair point. There's been some discussion, if both sides decide, the other party should unfilter first, well, you're kind of going to sit there forever, right? So this is an area where we're wondering, right? Like, how do you provide some kind of SLA or expectation for when the sessions will come up? We don't have anything today, but that is something we're interested in. And remember, there is always the fallback of, well, send an email. Obviously, we don't want people to send emails that aren't necessary, but that is sometimes necessary, right?
Ben again, work online. I think I agree with Rudiger's point. I think the problem is not kind of a conception of like SLA timers and stuff like that. I think that you're carrying way less state in the protocol than you're going to end up needing. I think you're going to need some sort of a state machine to model that process properly, which is going to be big and clunky, but I think pretty unavoidable.
Yeah, we kind of already acknowledged that partially in the draft. The goal here is at one point or another, you'll need to do consensus at one point, right? Like is one of those things like, well, we configure our routers every 6 hours, for example. Google configures theirs every 24 hours. What's the consensus? What's the overlap? But give them the benefit of the doubt, right? So at that point, you kind of need to get into a consensus agreement. It's the same thing with the unfiltering side of things. Amazon doesn't want to unfilter first. Cloudflare doesn't want to unfilter first either. So if we set up Cloudflare to Amazon, who unfilters first, right? This is not, the aspect or the question of like, who pulls their gun out first kind of situation. So
yeah,
maybe, that, or like youngest ASN or oldest ASN. I don't know. It's like, we'll find something, I'm sure. But yeah, those are open-ended questions. And I agree that that's definitely available for work.
Yeah, well, okay, kind of, to me, it would look like very straightforward. The requester actually includes in the request the email for the response. We accept it, we reject it. Please expect session to come up at on.
So, I mean, Rudiger, yeah, but even if this doesn't automate everything, if it just ends up like going into a ticketing system, it would still be nice, right? Like you'd still have all the info you need and like somebody gets involved, but you have all the stuff instead of like, here's a 50-page email explaining the person's life history first.
All right, we've come to the end of this specific time slot.
You didn't close the queue yet. As a very heretic idea, I'm not opposed theoretically to having support in the routing daemon to accept a copy paste of the API output just to configure the parameters for the session correctly, which could be useful.
So speaking as chair, I think in summary, the group suggests that maybe a formal description of a provisioning workflow expressed as a state machine to work through the dance of who does what action first to help shape expectations on both sides of the handshake. The AD indicated that in their interpretation, this falls in the charter. So from my perspective, I will then proceed to issue a call for working group adoption, and we take things from there. So thank you very much for being here, and I am interested to hear what comes out of the site meeting tomorrow. And cool.
Thank you.
The big BMP slide deck. Next up, Paolo Lucenti. Um, you know the drill. Tell me when you want the next slide.
Hello. So yeah, update on TLV, EBIT, and REL for a first round. So next slide, please. Just to recap, like the TLV draft, what is that about? We don't have, TLVs in every message. So let's make all the 4 legs of the table equal. Next slide, please. So what happened since the last one, since the last meeting? So we have, there has been a little bit of reworking. So the stateless parsing TLV that we have there, before we had like one TLV for each of the, the add path or the multi-label and things like that. And so we said that let's do just one TLV with, bit field, right? So we also never specified whether, if we don't have this information for stateless parsing in the root monitoring, what to do. So if it's not there, then it's like you should revert to the old behavior. So you go to the PRAP that probably you cached, and so you look there all the capabilities from the BGP open. The second thing is that like we had this group TLV, and I have to admit I had this bad idea to say that we have a RIB, and then we have a number of NLRIs, and then we want to make groups, and so like okay, we start counting from after the last NLRI, right? So there is quite a bit of state in there, and so essentially like already thought, in Prague, that was a bad idea. And then Dhananjay, he came essentially with the same comment. And so essentially like, we just set the GBit to 1 for the index. And so essentially the groups can have an independent indexing compared to the NLRIs in the message. And because of that, we can also remove the need for group TLVs to have group ID, group index and index, where the index was always set to 0, right? Next slide. So I am especially very happy. I mean, this was a big polish up this for the group TLV. And then the other thing is that, like we said, so we already had a note about ordering of the TLVs, so we should start, from TLV 0 and so forth. And so just because logically, maybe you first want to define the groups, and second, you want to define how to parse the BGP update if you have the stateless parsing. We are just recommending that probably those should have a TLV value that is a TLV type that is less than the BGP update that you want to parse next. And we updated the wire format example. There was Shunwen, he was very instrumental in finding a few errors. I found a few more, so now it's spot on. Please, next slide. So at the moment, there is really no open issues. All the feedback has been processed. And as always, I said before, I mean, this is becoming a little bit more complex than it was at the beginning. Still, it's very nice to read. It flows when you read this draft. But it's good, a little bit that we collectively review it, and we see whether, everything makes sense. And very importantly, also as part of this, also to implement it, because then that's where we will catch a number of probably other things maybe we didn't think about. So this is for this draft. Next one, please. The EBIT draft, next one. So the EBIT is simply like, originally we have TLVs where there is, just IANA, assigned code points. And so we said like it happens in IPFix, let's have the EBIT. So we have this bit at the beginning where we say this is a private, let's say, assigned space, so that we can toy a little bit with, transitioning features from, a vendor specific to publicly available, for example. Next slide, please. And so there has been not much work on this draft, except processing feedback from Luke, which will made a lot of sense because now we don't have only the index, but we have also the pang. The pang was included in the length of the TLV, but the index was not. And the index was coming first and the pang after, and so it's like you are counting a size, but it's not contiguous. So it just makes a lot of sense to polish this thing out. So thanks, Luke. Next slide, please. There is actually no feedback to process, not some feedback to process. So there is no open issues, there is no feedback to process, and this draft, of course, depends on the other draft, on the TLV one. We should also, implement this and see that everything sticks together. Next slide, please. And so this is the REL draft, the root event logging. So next slide, please. So what is the intuition here is that we have in BMP originally, we have state synchronization, we have debugging with root mirroring, stats and session reporting and things like that, but we don't really have anything event driven. Right, so anything that we can do alerting, reporting, or like for a state change, for on change analysis, we have to always take, I don't know, being pre-policy and post-policy. We should take these two huge tables and then compare what is the difference. So what if we have just something that tells us what is the difference instead of finding it out? So that's the intuition behind this draft. Next slide, please. So also on this draft, there has been quite some work. So first of all, I incorporated the feedback from Jeff and Rudiger. I mean, because if it was policy discard for why we are being reported an LRI, then essentially it's a string. The implementers can implement it the way they want. Rudiger was saying I like return codes, and Jeff was saying probably we want a vector of information. So it has been a little bit relaxed and fleshed out a bit better. There is a second important thing, which is that in already previous version of the draft, I did clearly set a boundary between the path marking TLV for route monitoring and REL. I didn't do the same thing between REL and route mirroring. So what I did is that I put a little note in the operational consideration. This was part of some feedback from Ahmed, and there is more later. I have a next slide about, let's say what is this precisely about. It's a little bit bigger than just this one line. And then, of course, we have group TLV and stateless parsing TLV also here because we have NLRIs. So I have added that. I mean, it's exactly the same as the TLV draft. And the document was adopted compared to the previous meeting. Next slide, please. So let's come to this route mirroring versus route event logging, right? So route mirroring, it exists from the super beginning, and there are two use cases: the verbatim copy of routes, not state compressed, and then there is the second one, which is if there is an erroneous packet, you just sample that packet, right? Now we have route event logging, where we have alerting, reporting on change analysis, feedback loop use cases, and also the sample of erroneous packets, right? So it's like there is a clearly, we are doing the same thing in two parts. So essentially, as I capture in the next slide, but I will stay here because it's more visual, right? So we have a few options here. So one is we say that the sample of erroneous packets should stay in route mirroring, and we remove it from here. Or we just say that it is right now. You can do it in one way or in the other, but probably it's a duplication. It's never a good thing to do. And in this case, at the moment, I have just put in the operational considerations that if you are a new implementation, you don't implement not one and not the other. If you not root mirroring and not root event logging, probably if you want to do sample, if you want to sample erroneous packets, you should implement rel over root mirroring. I mean, just a recommendation, but we can review and discuss. And of course, the other thing is that we can just say that the sample of erroneous packets should go instead from the root mirroring. I don't have a solid opinion. I'm really looking for feedback. Maybe the only thing that I was thinking myself is that I read the root mirroring. I don't think about sampling of erroneous packets, right? I think about it when I see event logging. So it would kind of make sense to me to go like in the direction that, to bash this functionality from the root mirroring. But super open, no solid opinion. We have also John that is from the original, RFC. So it's always, good feedback to get. And so yeah, next slide. And next slide. So essentially, where are we? First of all, there is really still some feedback to process. For example, Thomas, there is your feedback to process where you wanted some extra code points for the events when you are tree passing prefix limits, for example. I have to update. We have a few code points. I have to detail other TLBs that I didn't flesh out already. And then there is, of course, the big question from Jeff, which is like, what shall we do with this draft? Is this, good? Are we good like this? We want to do more or whatever. So, for example, at the moment, we don't really enter into feedback loop use cases, but for example, there was Alex Asimov that had something for segment routing. I think very informally, I asked the Jeff, shall we do something feedback loop for flow spec and things like that? And so still open questions. And because of these open questions, one possibility would be also to make the BGP update PDU TLV let's say, optional, so that maybe you can intercept more. So still open questions, open to feedback, and essentially that's it. So next slide, and if you have questions.
I think this is the last slide.
Yeah, of this deck.
Yeah, okay. Okay, questions?
Ben, work online. Not so much questions as feedback to the one question you had. I agree. I think that the erroneous update logging thing should be in the event-oriented message. And I think there's a couple of concrete reasons for that, as opposed to just a purely conceptual one, which I think agrees with it. I mean, if I imagine a world in which I've got kind of two BMP stations, one which is attached to a state synchronization subsystem, and another one which is for kind of logging and doing kind of alerting and stuff like that. Nice. I don't really want. I kind of on that second one, I don't really want to have to do the route monitoring support just to get the context for that event. So I think that I kind of agree with you that maybe kind of pointing implementers to like, if you do it in this place, then you don't need to do it in this place anymore. But I think if there's going to be one mandatory place where it should live, it's in the event-driven message. Yeah, I think that's a pretty obvious question. I don't think you'll get much pushback from other people about that.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, Thomas Graf, Swisscom. Just wanted to confirm also same opinion on my side, and maybe one feedback. I think the draft so far is good. I think let's keep it simple. I think we have now coverage of the RIPs. We have coverage how it's being installed in the RIP with the path marking. Now we're getting also visibility in the route policies, especially for the most important cases. So I think that's a good starting point.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas.
To close the loop, please let the chairs know when you would like us to take actions like working group last call.
Sure. Yeah. No, there is still a lot of work to do, so no worries. Okay. So,
Next up.
That's what you love. All right. So to be honest with you, this first presentation, like about lockrib, there has not been many updates, if not just editorial changes. So I would say next slide. Next slide. Okay. And but we wrote the version, so at least that I have to say. So, and then we have the local path ID one, where just to remind what is a little bit the intuition here. The intuition is that like when you have, for example, add path, you have per session ID, right? And so you have add path between, for routing, and then let's say you have add path for monitoring. So it's two different, sessions, and guess what? The IDs could be different, right? So here what we are just saying is that let's do a path per box, like per router, per thing, right? So that let's say we have, routing session, we have a monitoring session, essentially we have the same ID, right? And this is maybe becoming even very capital. It can become very capital in future if, for example, then we start sending this ID also for correlation between data plane and control plane, right? So that is the intuition behind this draft, right? Next slide, please. Okay, we received comments. We changed the draft, and there is also working implementation. Go ahead, next slide, please. So the first big comment we received from, it was from Jeff, and Jeff, of course, said, like, I mean, this is going to cost something, like, compared to not having it. So that is obvious, I would say. So what we did is like we introduced, like we, before we were just saying that the unicity, the scope of the ID was the NLRI, but now we just said like if you want to keep it, okay, otherwise you can set your unicity, your scoping. We, let's say, added in the recommendation the VRF-ID, hoping that so in this way, you can, if you have a one prefix tree, I mean, you can do everything in just one pass, essentially. And that's it, essentially, like there was some other minor fixes over there. And next slide, please. So this is just a recap of how, the wiring, things on the wire would look like. So now we have this subtype code points where either you give the local path ID or you say the local path ID is not available. And we have reasons. Next slide, please. Where essentially the reasons could be, I mean, these three so far, essentially. And of course, it was not, it was just a case that was not handled in the previous version. I mean, we should be conscious that we may not have the local path ID. Next slide, which I think is the, or yeah, and so essentially all of this has been, implemented in FRR, which was a little bit of a nice exercise for us, a little bit. So first of all, it is, it is possible to do it. And to go back to Jeff's point, I mean, of course, this is either computationally expensive or memory expensive, and it's obvious, right? So either it's computationally expensive because you have to go and check every time, which ID you issued for a destination. So you save on the memory, but you have CPU, intensive, or you start, having a little bit of memory structures for that. So you are consuming memory, but you are efficient on the CPU. So yeah, so that's that, and there is also, let's say, the pull request, the tree, the fork of FRR, where essentially all of this work was made by Maxence. And that's it, right? I think this is the last slide. Oh, okay, yeah, we also, yeah, made updated YANA consideration, and we have to implement it on the collector side.
Can someone close the door, please? Yeah, no worries. Just charge a little bit of money if people want to
Um,
leave the room.
yeah. Next slide. I think this is the last. Thank you. Any questions? Tomatoes. Tomatoes. We made them. Yeah, exactly. One is already here. Yeah.
Is it a fruit or a vegetable?
It's a tomato.
No questions for Mr. Lucenti? Oh.
Tom, Cloudflare, I was wondering if there's any appetite to just forcing the specific implementation. So instead of going, you can either implement it computationally heavy or you can implement it memory heavy, just dictating, well, do memory implementation.
It's one of those things that I would leave a little bit underspecified because, I mean, you can make always recommendations, like, so this is our experience, and based on this experience, we recommend this or that. But the truth is that when you go in memory structures or other considerations, a little bit more low level, you want to leave it underspecified because otherwise you can have vendors, pulling out of implementing it. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Tobias. And Tobias is giving us an update on a working group document, the BGP operational security update.
So, yeah, good morning.
Maybe okay, you have two choices. You can do it like Freddie Mercury, where you just hold it. Or
There you go. Excellent. So that seems to work well. So microphones are not my expertise. So let's get started. So since last time, there have been a couple of changes in a -1. So the scope has been clarified. There were several comments concerning TCP/AO. There were also comments concerning the confinement of management and out-of-band, in-band management control point protection. There was some additional contextualization of IBGP and TCP authentication. Expanded AS pass filtering. So overall, the whole draft has actually grown quite a lot. And if we go to the next slide, there has actually been quite some more that has been added. For example, one of the things people really wanted to see when talking to operators was some guidance on whether you should use local pref on IXP links. Hint, you shouldn't, and whether you should go GSHOT. Yeah, you should. However, you might have noticed there's an additional person on the author list now, which is Nick Hilliard. Nick wrote an email to the mailing list. Next slide, please.
Navigating a trackpad is difficult.
The bottom line of that mail was that the current draft is kind of putting all eggs into one basket, including chicken eggs, ostrich eggs, and a couple of other species. Currently, the draft kind of tries to be comprehensive and just include everything that is kind of known to us. That makes it really difficult to eventually reach consensus because with this setup, the document will take years. People will always find that one special shed they want to be really specific about. The reality around us will probably change faster than we can keep track and updating the document and including everything that should go in there. And for some things, it's even unclear when they will be stable enough or not to be included in such a document. There's also a terms list that is a little bit like RFC 8499 DNS terminology, but it's also just a subject and does not really belong into that draft. And in general, neither BCP 194 nor the current ID are abstract enough to actually be in some form timeless. So several of the more specific points raised by Nick were actually verbatim copies from BCP 194. Next slide, please. At the same time, Nick informed me that there actually are quite some policymakers kind of eyeing BCP 194 because they are looking for guidelines, inspiration, creative ideas to put into documents, or more like policy/laws that do like cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. And policymakers tend to be kind of not so good with like must, should, and what different capitalization means, which by the way is also lacking in BCP 194. And the notion of my network, my rules might not really come out. Furthermore, policymakers kind of like things that are testable. So if a draft says something about like something should be in a certain way, they really like this to make this a criterion to be tested. And while we are currently kind of able to ignore some of the more outdated and not really that feasible parts of BCP 194 anymore, that can get really difficult if it is codified in law. Next slide, please. So let's just try to spin up a possible extreme version of interpreting BCP 194. So BCP 194 recommends announcing IXP lands with the route server, or each peer to their cone with their own ASN if the route server doesn't do that. I heard this is a great way to make friends with people running IXPs if you do that. And RIPE 804 sets a minimum v4 size for an IXP allocation to /26, and ARIN proposition 320 is somewhat similar, even though we're not yet passed. And some IXPs also use /64's v6 for different peering lands. So IXPs and ISPs tend to be critical infrastructure. And well, terminology is kind of unclear sometimes. Peering with peers. A peer is maybe a peer with which you have no peering relationship because it's a customer. Those things, kind of ambivalent. Next slide, please. So if we have a worst case expression, IXPs must announce a peering land prefix if they are considered critical infrastructure, meaning up to /64v6 and up to /26v4 must be accepted for all BGP neighbors. ISPs must announce the peering land prefixes of all IXPs they are connected to if these do not announce them. IXPs must create route objects for all members of the peering land, or ISPs must announce prefixes they are not authorized to announce. Well, you can go on. IRR tool, for example, is also codified, and if people copy paste from this, I mean, we all went to school and copy pasted homework assignments, it usually doesn't get better. So not an ideal outcome we might be having. Next slide, please. So there's a couple of options forward. So ideally, what we would like to propose is that we split out some parts from the current draft. So keeping the core of the document that focuses on the more timeless parts of it. So truths about BGP security, the purpose, goals, high level, what can actually replace BCP 194 as a BCP. And then we take the informational document listing like the basket of things, of techniques you can maybe use if you want to attain certain properties. Maybe you can use something else. It's not really prescriptive, more like a detailing thing, overview thing of what is there. And another informational document, which can be used as like, well, documenting what terminology we are currently using to refer to what things. And ideally be somewhat quick before things become laws. Next slide, please. And the core point about the reduced draft is to be short enough so policymakers actually do read it. Generic enough to be resilient to certain technology changing, testable independent of implementation, and published quick enough to prevent harm. Next slide, please. The securing BGP, a list of techniques, list possible ways of accomplishing securing BGP speakers, BGP route exchange, etc., etc., etc. Which also means that if you make this an informational document, techniques can be neutrally described as something that exists and something that has a certain effect if you use it. And you don't have to be prescriptive in what to actually use. See also the discussion with MTA, STS, and DANE for the male people. And it basically means that we can go for a more extensive list in contrast to whether we would put that into a BCP without risking people being like, yeah, no, but I don't like to have that specifics in there. I only want to have mine because it's informational. Next slide, please. And then we, of course, could have a terminology document, which is somewhat similar to RFC 8499, BCP 219, DNS terminology, but for BGP-related terms. Idea would be to not make this a BCP as well, but more go descriptive, like how we are currently using language to talk about things in the routing ecosystem, for basically the same reason as with the list of techniques document. We want to be able to more quickly update it, and we don't want to bike shed around what specific terms mean. So kind of an Oxford style approach, as Nick called it, versus the French prescriptive style of building dictionaries. Next slide, please. So what I basically want to use the remainder of time we have now for is discussion. So plain, we kind of have consensus that BCP 194 needs to change. How is like the other thing. If we wait too long, we may no longer be able to easily change it. And it should be that we focus on the draft that goes more into the high level vision of making secure things and avoiding bike shedding of specific details. Thoughts?
All right, Ben, you're first in queue. And Tobias, thank you for the updates and the work you're doing on this document.
Ben, Work Online again. Thank you for picking up this work. It's a lot of work. As promised, I did have a brief reread this morning to try and refresh my memory a little bit. And I didn't hate it as much as I thought I was going to.
It's subtle.
There's, I mean, I think there's quite a lot of culling that can happen and needs to happen, especially given the concerns about this being kind of copied and pasted into regulations in various parts of the world. There are lots of places where we spill over from being security operational guidelines to just like, this is how you should touch computers kind of guidelines, like, you know, doing things atomically, doing things with idempotent procedures.
So you're currently talking about the current version of the draft?
Yes, I am.
Not BCP 194. Okay.
No. I'm talking about the current version of the draft. I think there's a lot of, like, if we think we need to write down like how to interact with computers well, let's do that somewhere else. I think this is a really hard document to kind of keep in existence. We just don't have the tools for keeping this kind of document current in the IETF. We can have a more general purpose discussion about how this could be a long-lived and frequently refreshed document if we want, but we've kind of tried that before and failed pretty dismally. I'm kind of not convinced that it should exist before at all in light of that, at least in its current form. If we think that it has to exist for one reason or another, I think that we should try and stick to principles rather than practices. And we should make those principles be pragmatic. Like, let's not tell people not to use local pref to prefer peering links to transit links, because they're going to. And all we're going to do is succeed in writing a document that does not document operational practice and is never going to. Yeah. I had like editorial stuff and stuff like that. I'll try and do a proper review at some stage and send you written comments. But as kind of principle stuff, that's my high level feedback.
So yes, so that is actually also the proposal, to just cut everything out that is not high level principle stuff.
Yep.
And I would suggest you wait with a review until we went through there with a chainsaw, because otherwise you're reviewing stuff that is not relevant in the current context.
Okay.
Jeff has, so for the definition section, the IDR chairs have actually talked about we need a flavor of this thing anyway, because we do not have consistency across the RFC series for just even BGP things. We were originally thinking about it, one part in terms of something generally useful for the outside world, but also one of the consumers is actually the RFC editor. So when you get around to having that bit of conversation, we're going to be looping them in as well. Second piece for Ben's comment about how do we maintain this thing. Let's get this thing to the point where we ship it at least once. We have GitHub these days. We didn't have that before. There's nothing that stops us basically from having a rolling internet draft that refreshes every 6 months with no edits.
Yeah, Ben triggered me with the whole like living documents discussion. I mean, there's nothing that really would stop us from putting a whole bunch of effort at publishing this as an RFC once, and then like making a commitment to ourselves that we're going to publish a new version every like year or something like that, and sort of an agreement in the working group to not nitpick every single possible thing. Like much of the issue with publishing a new RFC is not actually the like turning the crank. It's that as soon as you open it, everybody's like, oh, I want this particular word. Maybe we can do better, or yeah, maybe we're just screwed.
Yeah. So I would argue that that would be a nice thing to try, but that we should have like this high level umbrella thing, and then we can do that process with the detailed ones.
Tom Cloudflare. I'm not sure if I agree with that. I mean, one of the issues with BCP 194 is that it exists.
End of sentence.
I don't think anyone disagrees with that at this point. The issue that I'd like to avoid with this is that we come with a new BCP in one way or another, and we make the commitment now. It's like, yeah, we'll keep it updated, and then we don't. And then we end up in a position where either lawmakers or other operators or new operators read the document as being not just informational and implement the thing, and then somehow in one way or another blow up the routing table. So I'm not sure if that's the right approach to do with this either.
Jared Mach, Akamai. I think we should just probably try and get a new document out, because the alternatives that I can see, be they GitHub or, I mean, the IETF does technically maintain a wiki, so we can edit it, Wikipedia style. I think getting a document out is really the right mechanism here. And then I think the impetus is on, the chairs and the IESG and even the IAB, who are the ones who would be responding to some of these things to make sure that they're reaching down into the appropriate subject area expertise when it comes to any external relations, liaison, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I do kind of agree with, sorry, Warren Quarry. I do kind of agree with what you say, but BCP 194 already exists. And like, unless we're willing to deprecate that and make it historic, like this work should be better than that, hopefully. It's entirely possible that we'll make a commitment to ourselves that we're going to keep updating it and won't. But even so, I think that's better than where we are now.
I also like the TTL idea.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, so for my overview, you're going to slim down the current draft that is intended as a replacement for 194. You are considering to add a second document for terminology, and then a third document targeted at policymakers.
No. So the idea would be we make a BCP 194 replacement, which focuses on like the high level goals and purposes of BGP security, making sure that you do not redistribute things you're not supposed to be redistributing, you're not ingesting things, but more on the principle side. Then like that becomes the BCP 194 replacement. In addition, we have a possibility to get an informational document detailing terminology, as also Jeff mentioned, that is kind of needed to make sure people, well, at least know what other people use to talk about things, and have another informational document as basically a summary of what is available to attain the goals listed in BCP 194. With the letter 2 not necessarily having to be out first. It's more about let's clean up 194 first, and then we do actually have some more time to get to the bike shedding about the rest.
Thank you for that clarification. Anne.
When I'm looking at this, first I note the working group that delivered the first one took ages on the document. And
for clarification, it was not this working group.
No, of course, I was referencing in open the working group that did it. And I'm pretty sure the goal and the ideas about the audience of the document were practitioners. And as the BCP says, about essentially best practices. Well, if we start to consider potential audiences like dramatists making theater out of it, or policymakers, well, okay, kind of the question is which audiences actually are reasonable to consider, or how to protect audiences that are kind of not being addressed by the context, to not use it in improper ways. From my interactions with supposed policymakers, I have to say they actually did not go for this document, because for the short text that they wanted to use, such a document was obviously not a source. Specifically, BSI, the German Federal Agency for IT Security, had the goal for fixing or for giving the regulator, which is another one, text. And well, okay, in fact, these BSI guys usually show up at IETFs. This time not. Well, okay, they actually consulted some known local experts about it. Now, of course, other policymakers and regulators may operate completely different. But well, okay, can we address and take care of all insanity that's around? Certainly not. Kind of, yes, make sure that we go high level abstract, and make sure that best practice documentation that goes into the nitty-gritty stays somewhere else, of course makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My comment is slightly shorter than Rudiger's. I remembered a further thing that I wanted to mention. You mentioned the difficulty of defining exactly what a peer is, which is non-trivial. When I was writing a not that dissimilar document that describes our a kind of public-facing description of our external routing policy, I found the distinction customer non-customer much more helpful than the distinction customer transit peer. You might want it, that might be helpful to clean things up.
I think the current version of the document already goes in that direction.
It sort of, it
Like
kind of, it uses like upstream and customer, and then kind of hopes that you know that there's a peer in there somewhere in the mix.
And BGP neighbor to describe adjacency, and upstream and etc. are, I think, from the ASPA draft.
Yeah, I mean, you'll find that most of the distinctions from a policy perspective are, is this thing a customer or not? Not, is this thing a transit or a peer? And in a couple of cases, you can make that distinction as and when more specifically.
As I said.
All I'm saying is, I think if you're doing a run through and a cleanup, that's probably a helpful thought to have in the back of your mind.
So Warren Kamari, Google. This might be a bad idea, but I'll point out that a BCP is actually like a grouping label. And you had mentioned a couple of different documents that you wanted to have. So like BCP 195 is actually RFC 8996 and RFC 9325. So you could do the like BGP thing, and then the terminology could all be grouped together into sort of one overarching set.
So to close considerations about the like BCP state having implications on how often you can change it.
Thank you, Tobias. Oh no. So we uploaded, we're converting PowerPoint to PDF, and the system tried it, and we ended up with this. And our fine presenter generated the PDF. And why is it not in the document?
At least it hasn't overlaid a partition.
Get out of the queue, Warren. So I'm not entirely sure why the system didn't refresh the new submission from half an hour ago. But let's give it a try and see how it goes.
Let's begin at the page 2.
We are. This is page 1.
Okay.
Let's go to page 2.
Okay. Hello everyone. I'm Li Jimin from China Mobile. It's also my first time attending the IETF meeting, so I'm very glad to be here today. I'm going to introduce 2 drafts. Additional new BMP set types and definition for aggregated BMP route monitoring message. The first draft defines several new SR message types for monitoring interesting events on routers. As the BGP protocol continues to expand, more features and functions are deployed through the BGP protocol, making it increasingly important to monitor relevant event information of these functions. Okay, next slide, please. In this draft, we defined several types corresponding to Ribbon and Revolve stat types, including root threshold, AS path threshold, and the root origin validation. Next slide, please. In some scenarios, we need to limit the size of the root table to prevent the root from receiving too many BGP routes. As too many BGP routes could occupy a lot of resources on router, leading to performance degradation. It is especially the case when the router is deployed in a large and complex network such as China Mobile's CMNet. So therefore, we define type 1 and 2 to count the number of routes rejected by the root threshold. More precisely, is the number of post-policy Ribbon routes, which are those that will not be loaded into the local RIB. And type 3 and 4 define the number of post-policy Ribbon routes rejected due to license threshold, license customer route threshold restrictions. Next slide, please. And we define the type 5 and 6 to count the number of routes rejected due to the AS pass for being too long, and the number of each FI and SFI. Okay, next slide, please. With the deployment of RPKI, monitoring statistics for RPKI are expected to be increasingly popular. In this draft, we also define type 7 to 9 to count the results of root origin validation. For 3 results of validation, invalidated, validated, and not found, we define 3 statistical types. Next slide, please. And as for rebut, we also define the statistics for the routes rejected by the AS path length threshold. And next slide, please. And the statistics for the root origin validation. But differently, the RFC 88 and 93 specifies the rules of routine validation behavior of rebot. Whether the router supports the RFC will affect rebot statistics because egress policy may change the result from invalidated to validated or vice versa. So we suggest that rebot statistics types for root origin validation should not be applied if the RFC 8893 is not implemented in router. So next slide, please. So I think this is all the new stat types we defined here. And thank you. Any comments? Welcome.
Jeff has. So we've chatted on the list about the contents of the different counters you're requesting. I have no further comments on them. That conversation can continue. So this is partially addressed to the chairs. We adopted Mukul's draft for some counters, and part of the conversation we had at that time is these things are now available, thanks to John, mostly first come, first serve. What we're really looking for is having working group review on any of the counters coming in, even though we can do first come, first serve, just to make sure the things make sense. And as he asked on the mailing list, could we just merge the documents? Mukul and I had a conversation about this. We don't really care. What we're fundamentally looking for from the working group is a reasonable way to pipeline review of the new counters and quick assignment so code can happen.
I hear you.
Thomas Graf, can you go to slide number 4? Great. I made a comment on the mailing list, and I think also Jeff commented on the first two counters that it's hard for an implementation. Basically, routes who are already being dropped to be monitored. And here, my proposal is the following: that this counter is being changed. That basically we see how many routes we have left until we are reaching actually the maximum limit. And we are leveraging what Paolo just showed us before with the event logging, that we actually the routes who are being dropped, that we are logging them, and then basically we have both of that until we're reaching the maximum limit. We have the counters you're proposing, and we have the event logging. And for the second thing on the license customized route threshold, my proposal is here, since this is more vendor specific, and I think Jeff commented that also on the mailing list, why not using the enterprise TLVs for that? Thanks.
Rüdiger Volk, maybe I'm completely confused. These stat counters look to me like something that I would like to see in some young model. Pardon? No, I'm not a fan of ASN1. Is this confusion or? And well, okay, kind of in the young model, kind of the thing that I like is, well, okay, I actually get symbolic names instead of numbers.
I'm trying to put myself in the queue. Jeff has. So wearing my hat as one of the editors for the BGP Yang model. And this is actually a useful generic conversation back to the working group. All these things that we're putting in as stats, most of the existing ones are covered by counters we already have in the model. So valid observation. For each of the things that are new, including the ones for the presentation here, one of the discussion points is easily, can these things go into the Yang model? The answer is yes. Yang is very friendly about allowing for augmentations to models. And at the moment, the IDR module is not actually shipped as an RFC. If it's a counter that makes sense to extend that is already well covered, great. If it's something that isn't, draft a augmentation model. That's wonderful. I think there could be good conversation between Grow and IDR chairs as to who should own the Yang module itself. It doesn't necessarily have to be an IDR, but that's probably a more natural place for it. I think it's actually better to probably centralize the work in one working group in terms of where the counter is defined, and that the review happens between both working groups when we're to that point.
Ben, work online. So following on from that, it kind of feels to me like what we want is not a vast number of new definitions of new counters, and more a general purpose way of saying, send me this leaf from the BGP Yang module in BMP. That feels, and I mean, to your other point about where does it make sense to define these things? I think IDR is the natural fit for the simple reason that it's likely to get more review from implementers there to check whether something is actually doesn't require magic in order to compute the counter. A future that consists in reviewing a perpetual stream of new requests for BMP statistics, I don't really want to live in that world. Yes, I want you to live in that world, and I want to have a general purpose mechanism to consume it when I need to.
All right.
Next slide, please. Okay, this roughly is defined definition for aggregated BMP route monitoring message. BMP route monitoring message are used to send incremental BGP routes of peer announcements and withdrawals to the monitoring station as the BMP protocol continues to expand. More and more RM messages are being sent to the monitoring station, which makes it overwhelmed, and many of the messages are duplicated. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. The current RM messages structure is illustrated as follows, consisting of common header per peer header and BGP pass attribute. BGP update PDU. The BGP update PDU can be further divided into BGP pass attributes and prefix. Under the current message structure, when the router has n peers and needs to send the same prefix to them, the router needs to package them the prefix n times and assembling them into NRM messages and sending them to the monitoring station one by one n times. So it's apparently this method is inefficient and increase network load, and it's easy to cause the monitoring station to crash. Next slide, please. So we defined a type of aggregated BMP monitoring message composed of a common header, multi-peer header, and BGP update PDU. The newly added multi-peer header contains a variety of per-peer header, each followed by unique BGP pass attributes related to the per-peer route, related to the peer router. The common pass attributes and prefix are still retained in the BGP update PDU. By extracting unique pass attributes and combining them into the multi-peer header, we can combine multiple RM messages into one aggregated RM message, which will significantly reducing the duplication of common header and the common prefix, common pass attributes. Next slide, please. Moreover, by merging multiple RM messages, we can reduce the number of packaging and sending times. As before, when a router needs to send route updates to n peers, it would package NRM messages and send them to the monitoring station one by one n times. However, with the aggregated RM messages, only need to be packaged once and send it to the monitoring station. Next slide, please. From the table, we can see the differences between the ordinary RM message and aggregated RM messages. Aggregated RM message reduce the packaging and payload of common header, common BGP path attribute and prefix, all to one. That is a reduction of n-1 times. So it would be a very effective reduction, considering that n here is often a large number in reality. So the next slide, please. That is all I have here. Any comment? Welcome.
Jeff Haas. So this implies something about your implementation storage. No, quoting somebody else. I don't necessarily object to the format. No, it's a reasonable logical model to represent the state. I'm a little concerned that this sort of splits what BMP is doing in terms of all the various extensions for the Paolo BMP show, and may make it difficult to maintain things in more than one place. But beyond that, my main concern is for internet-style routing, path attribute sharing is relatively low. The average used to be about 5 prefixes was the average number of shareable prefixes for a given set of path attributes. So you seem to be implying, if I'm understanding the proposal well, multiple peers sharing the same path attributes, and here are the prefixes per peer. Is that correct?
Can we back to the aggregate and before? Okay, this
one?
slide. Yeah, this one. The aggregated BMP route monitoring message is we extract the unique BGP path attributes and BGP path attributes. So the common BGP path attribute and prefix are retained in the old position.
Okay, so you're refactoring the path attributes for some pieces are shared, but some pieces are not shared.
Yeah, in the report in the report situation is when a router receiving prefix from one of its peer and wants to send into 1, 2, 3, 4 in peers. So this is the situation we want to show the aggregated BGP RM message.
Okay. I think I understand your proposal. I'll send further comments to the mailing list.
Okay, thank you.
Ben, work online. I think that this is doable in principle. I'm not convinced that it's actually desirable in practice. It feels like, I think there's two potential problems with it. Firstly, it feels like you're moving work from a probably not that resource constrained monitoring station to a highly constrained router producing these messages, which doesn't feel like a sensible trade-off to me in general. And the second thing is, one of the nice things about BMP is the high fidelity that you get of the actual original message. And as soon as you're doing this kind of reformatting and munging it, it's quite difficult to recover what you're really looking at. If what you're looking at is not strictly malformedness, but nevertheless causing issues in practice messages that arrived on the wire. If you're kind of ripping them apart and kind of repacking them for efficiency, you lose that kind of level of insight. So I don't object to it existing so much, but I don't see a world in which this is useful for me, and I suspect that probably goes for quite a lot of other people.
Okay, thank
Okay, we have 2 more in the queue. Please keep it brief because we are going to run over by 2 or 3 minutes. Maria?
Hello, Maria Cizinek, developer of BERT. I'd like to comment that this is going to be a horrible thing for implementation because in the BMP and in BGP, we are packing basically by the whole set of attributes and looking for paths which have the same prefix with the same attributes or with the part of the attributes, and then finding those common parts of the path attributes. This is going to take much more resources than just sending it out. So I am saying, even though if this would become RFC, we are not going to implement it at all. Thank you.
All right. Paulo, you're the last one.
Yeah, I had a few comments. First is what problem is this solving? I mean, did you test this or did you test the impact? So this is going a little bit in the direction that Jeff was saying, like what is actually the sharing of attributes that you have here? Have you measured anything? So that is one thing. There is a second thing. I am mostly relying this comment that we discussed with Thomas, like because we read the draft and we were a little bit puzzled, like what is applicability? Like, so you have ADRI being pre-policy, post-policy, lock-rib, ADRI about pre-policy and post-policy, to where this applies, because we were wondering maybe this applies only to ADRI about post-policy, a little bit mimicking the peer group idea that you have in BGP. I don't know. We were a little bit puzzled. Yet another comment is that like there is no like, okay, this draft is about the route monitoring, but you have also peer up and peer down for the BGP sessions. So that aspect was not really tackled. And last comment is, sorry, I'm going fast, but the last comment was that like if this even would fly, and to be honest with you, I agree with what Ben and Maria, they were saying, like this can be very impactful in the wrong place, you know, and why to save bytes on the wire, right? For a monitoring protocol that is, you know, probably run on a management network, right? If this would even, I don't know, fly, I would say I would much rather see something tackled with the TLVs, because we are putting in place a whole infrastructure with the TLVs and things like that, rather than a multi-peer header and a new message type and things like that. So those were my comments, but we can discuss more later. I mean,
Okay.
if you prefer.
Okay.
I wanted just to, you know.
Okay. That would be nice.
Thank you so much. I hope there will be more follow-up on the mailing list. That is the best place to progress the discussion on this. And again, my apologies for not being able to whip up the correct slide deck at the last moment. We'll hopefully next time it goes better.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, very, very quick presentation. Jeff promised 2 minutes.
Question is, whether you have the slides or not. So I'm presenting this on behalf of one of our customers at Vodafone, who is doing his first IETF bit of work. You know, again, this is basically a slide's worth of no slide and then a question to the working group. Next slide. So TCP/AO is used regularly for BGP. It works great. Our implementation at Juniper uses basically the same code for BMP. This means that our BMP gets all of the TCP/AO niceness. TCP/AO is not specified for BMP. What do we want to do about that? And there's basically 2 places this can go. Thing number 1, just like IPsec's not specified, but that one's at least, that one is actually used, but it's not common. Well, that's a problem. what happens if we want to just say arbitrary encapsulations can be done? Want to wrap this thing in TLS or whatever? So question is basically, do we want to say, yes, we're willing to do a trivial RFC just to say, yes, this is a supported profile? The desire from Vodafone is that by having this in the RFC series, it could be used to provide hints to vendors. This is an important thing to support. And given how BMP has become an important tool for people's operations, and in some cases SDN, securing it seems like a good idea. Option number 2, decide this is trivial. Just go do the thing. We don't need spec. Comments?
The queue is closed.
I will.
I can talk anyway. So
yeah.
Oh, perfect. So is there? I guess is there a particular reason why we would want to prohibit any stream-based transport that the IETF specifies?
No.
Should we leave this undefined such that it can do all the things, or should we be explicit?
The request I've been asked the channel is at least this thing. John.
So this is fun. As I'm sure you at least remember, one of the most painful things about getting the BMP spec through the IESG back in the day, and specifically through the security area, was the lack of MTI security. And if we had had this, then they would have been so happy, and I would have been so happy too, because it would have been less work. I don't really see a downside to publishing a tiny little RFC that says, here's how you do it. It just seems like goodness. So I would support doing it with no hats at all on, by the way.
Okay. So where we will be taking this is a formal request to adopt this piece of work for a probably 2-page RFC, which will ask to be shipped in short order.
Thank you for the request. I acknowledge the request. And with that, I bring this session 6 minutes over time to an end. Hope to see you all at IETF 120 in Vancouver, Canada. Here we come. Thank you all.
OK，魏长城 is